Well, thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you today about material facts. Now, material fact isn't something new. In fact, under the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act, it was very much a reality that RICO was concerned about. But I think you'll find they're stepping it up a little bit under TRESA. And I think there's a couple of things we need to look at as it applies to sellers as well as buyers. So stay with me here. A material fact is any fact that will affect a client's decision to acquire or dispose of a piece of real estate and at what price. Notice it says a client's decision to buy or sell, to acquire or dispose of. And RICO says registrants are required to disclose all material facts relating to the acquisition or disposition of real estate to their clients as soon as possible. We, I think, understand latent defect, and a latent defect has to be disclosed to interested parties, but not so with a material fact. A material fact also has to be disclosed, but only to your clients. It's a very important distinction. When we think about material facts, we normally think about buyers, and we think about what it would affect their decision to buy a property or how much they would pay for it. The challenge here is that it's very subjective. What will impact one person may not impact somebody else. So you're going to sit down with your buyer as part of the qualifying process, and you're going to ask them a question something like this. Is there anything about a house that would deter you from purchasing it or affect the amount of money you would pay for it? And they'll say, well, I don't know. What do you mean? And you might bring out an example of, let's suppose somebody passed away in the house. Now, I would say if you're dealing a 100-year-old house, the odds are pretty good that somebody did pass away at some point way back in the distant past, because we didn't have hospices back then, and people tended not to go to the hospital. They tended to die in home. But we don't necessarily know that. So you give that as an example, and they say, well, no, that wouldn't bother me. So you know it's not a material fact for them. Might be for somebody else. But be careful when you're in this dialogue or conversation with your buyer that you don't lead them. I mean, you could say, they could say, well, is there anything else? You could say, well, what about a high crime area? Well, no, we wouldn't want to be in a high crime area. Well, how about if you had to pay through the nose for taxes? Well, no, we'd like taxes to be moderate and reasonable. And you can create your own list that are become material facts, but they wouldn't have been. So don't do that. But open up the possibility if there is anything that would really be urgent to them, and it might not come up unless you know to look for it. And I've got a little form, I'll share it at the end, where you can log down if there's any material facts as far as your buyer is concerned at that point in time. But let's talk about the seller. I don't think we think often about a material fact as it applies to a seller, but it absolutely is. I want you to imagine that you have a property for sale, you get an accepted offer, and prior to closing, let's say there's a 2 or 3 month closing, prior to closing, you discover that the buyer has assigned it to somebody else. He's not going to close. He's going to pass it on to somebody else, and OREA has these assignment forms specifically for this, but he makes a $50,000 lift. The seller's probably not amused, and the seller's going to say, what did he know that I don't know? And you don't want to be answering that question and it be information that you didn't explain to them. What about a property that has the potential to sever a lot off? My brother was living in Napanee. He was on 7.5 acre, kind of a quasi-country property, and he decided to put it up for sale because he was going to move to LA to be with his son. I said to him, Dan, why don't we sever a lot off? We can split this thing down the middle. It won't make a cent difference in terms of how much you get for the property, but you'll be able to get the money for the lot as well. Well, we did that. We got approval, severed the lot, sold the lot for $180,000. The real estate agent said, you know, that's just absolutely found money. Well, it is. And you may talk to a seller and say there's the potential there. Maybe it's a house is a knockdown, or maybe you can sever a lot off. And the seller says, well, I'm not interested in that at all. That's fine, but have that conversation, record it, that it is a material fact. And that way, if the buyer makes some money from doing that, the seller's not going to come back and say, you should have told me, I could have made that money. And we can look at possible zoning change. Maybe they're expanding the urban boundary. Any of these things, and you can presume that your seller knows, but maybe the seller doesn't know. It's a material fact that you need to disclose to your seller. What about the potential for granny flats? You got a bi-level with a walkout from the basement. You could very easily add a second dwelling in the lower level. The windows are large enough for egress, it's not a problem. And that would increase the saleability, increase the value of the property. And you have that conversation with your seller. Also, there's More Homes Built Faster Act in 2022, and under Regulation 299/19, it is now possible in an R1 zone to legally have a duplex or legally have a triplex. These granny flats were not legal. They required the owner to live in them, but now it isn't required for the owner to live in them. And you may have a house that's ideally set up to make a few modifications and turn it into a duplex or a triplex. And the seller may not have any interest in that at all, but the buyer might, and you want to make sure you've had that conversation with your seller, so after the fact he isn't saying, why wasn't I told I could have made this kind of a profit? So you need to be aware of these things. A developer buying up properties in the area, your seller doesn't know about it. He needs to know about it. And of course there can be negative things as well. Maybe there's a gravel pit going to be opening up down the road in a country setting, and that means if the road happens to be gravel, there's going to be dust and dirt back and forth as dump trucks drive up and down, and the seller probably would be better off to sell before that quarry opens up. Or what about air turbines that are going next concession over? Or what about you're in city, but there's a vacant lot across the street and there's going to be a high-rise apartment building built there. That might impact somebody's decision to buy that house. These are all material facts, and these are things you need to find out about and you need to disclose to your seller in writing ahead of time. And again, I've got a form that will be available at the end of this video, and you're welcome to download. It's just a simple little form that you go over with your seller. But let me come back to the buyer now. The first time you met with the buyer and asked the buyer if there's anything that was a material fact to them, like somebody dying in the property, and there probably aren't any. So you've got a worksheet and there's nothing in it. But now they've zeroed down to the property they're interested in, and the things that the seller's agent has discussed with the seller are things you need to find out about and discuss with your buyer. There may be the potential for added income, which will help you promote the sale, or there may be something negative possibly about the property that could be a deterrent. You've got to find these things out now specifically about the property. You can't rely on the seller telling you or the seller's agent telling you. They don't have to. As a material fact, they've got to tell their clients, not your clients. So you want to do your homework, find out that particular property, and then jot it down on a worksheet and make sure you give it to your buyer before he acquires the property. So you've done your homework as far as anything that would affect their decision to buy or sell, or how much they're willing to pay for it. I want to thank you very much for investing your time watching this video. I look forward to talking to you again next week.